Hello, everyone. Last time we talked about how Magic the Gathering set the stage for other customizable card games. And today we're going to talk about how Star Wars CCG forged its own path, how it was influenced by Magic the Gathering and chess, and became an iconic game. Let's get into it. So today we'll talk about the 1994 rules of Magic the Gathering and some of the issues of that. Talk about how the creation of Type 1 and Type 2 tournaments and games split the community. We'll talk about Star Wars CCG's goal to make Star Wars feel like Star Wars and not Magic the Gathering. We'll talk about how they designed their game to make it unique and iconic and different and better. And we'll also summarize. So, 1994 came after the 1993 rules and design was unbalanced. So they implemented a ban list, a limited list, max of 1, regular card limit, max of 4, 60 card minimum decks, which was up from 40 minimum, and they instituted a 2 out of 3 game system for tournament matches, along with a 15 card sideboard to switch between cards between games to add some skill, more skill involvement, less cheesy deck ability to win, and of course, to enforce all of the above, they needed deck lists. Now, some of the issues in the 1994 rules would be that keeping up with them would be theoretically cumbersome. Now you have to pay attention that some of these cards are banned. Realistically, however, the anti cards weren't terribly popular. Some players did use them, but a lot of people didn't like them. And of course, the Scheherazade card made a sub game of Magic, made the game go longer. So having this small list of banned cards in practice was probably not a really big deal. However, they did start introducing several cards that were in the restricted list. You did have to pay attention to what these were. Half the cards, I would say, didn't terribly matter that much. The one saving grace of this is that the ones that were on the restricted list, the bottom ones, the Power 9, they did tend to be expensive. There weren't a ton of them, so restricted them, was overall okay with most players. Now, in 1995, they did create a split community when they created the two different types of games. So Type 1 would be kind of the classic the way it was. You'd have every set was legal, you'd have restricted list, small ban list, and the Type 2 would have the latest 2 sets and then the most current basic set, but everything else would be banned. All future tournaments would be Type 2 and not Type 1. The reason they gave this was to seek to create an ever-shifting play environment. And as of that time, these were kind of the allowed sets. So by the time in 1995, Alpha, Beta, and Limited would be banned for Type 2. The revised edition, which would be the base set, would be allowed. And kind of the first 3 sets you see there would not be allowed. And you can see some details about that. Now, when people heard about this announcement, some people liked this change. These rules are wonderful. Way to go, WTC. This person said, I'm getting tired of getting moxed and lotuses. I just don't like the snobby attitude. So he wants to try something different. Other people didn't like this idea. So, this person said, we paid good money for these cards. Now they're not officially sanctioned. It would just get worse as more expansions come out. This person says, doesn't this upset anyone? Don't we think we should let WTC know that players have been competing tournaments since Limited Unlimited and they don't like having their cards made useless in the tournaments of Type 2? Person said, would it not have been better to just ban the out-of-print restricted Type 1 cards for Type 2, right? I get why you want to ban maybe Moxen and the Black Lotus, but why does Twiddle or Headless Horseman, need to be banned? So by the end of December 1995, this is what Type 2 looked at. So they banned a few more cards. They banned Channel. And they, of course, all the anti-cards were banned. They restricted all of these cards. So you could, have, a max of those ones. And then these were no longer restricted. So legendary cards, you could only have one of the legendary card of a particular kind in your deck, but then they changed that if you have multiple copies, you can, although you can only have one legendary at a time of the exact same card. There was some weirdness with Chronicles because Chronicles reprinted cards from older sets, including Arabian Nights, The Dark, etc. And so In the earlier sets, this card would have been been banned, but the card to the right of it would have been legal. So it was just kind of weird for them to kind of figure out. And you can kind of see the lists that were allowed by the end of 1995. So Star Wars CCG explicitly wanted to be different from Magic the Gathering. They wanted to capture the essence of these licenses. Star Wars CCG was also inspired by chess, which has simple rules with deep gameplay. And the main designer of Star Wars CCG, Tom Braunleich, was also a chess player. You can see some of his ratings here, 2101. He hosted 3 tournaments several years ago, and you can see that there. So also the official explanation of Star Wars CCG also referenced chess. So imagine playing a game of chess where each player could select from 1,000 pieces, each of which move differently. You would select your 16 pieces in secret, and so would your opponent. Sitting opposite him, surveying the board, you would make them attack based on the pieces you selected and form your defenses based on the pieces your opponent selected. And go on, go on. So they were definitely inspired by chess. They definitely wanted a deep strategy game with relatively simple rules and setup. And you can read that there. So Magic the Gathering gave each player starting life total. Typically start with 20, and when it gets to 0, they lost. You need to track this somehow. The original rules talked about using chips. You could also use a pen and paper, something else like that. And then, however, with Star Wars CCG, they made it so that each card in your deck would be your life force, and taking damage meant losing cards. So because you don't need pen, paper, or chips, you don't need to track how much life you have. Your total cards left is your life force, and the remaining you have left to lose or win the game. Now, Magic the Gathering also created certain cards which added creature tokens to the battlefield. So one example here is the Hive. It's from Alpha. And of course, these will require pennies, chips, tokens, etc. to represent here. However, there are no such cards of this kind in Star Wars CCG. And in this sense, Star Wars CCG is more streamlined than Magic the Gathering. You need nothing else than a 60-card deck. No outside materials, no pen and paper to track your life, no chips, tokens, etc. Magic the Gathering also had various cards that try to introduce randomness. So there's some cards such as Mind Twist, discard random cards from hand. It could be cards that you have flipping coins, like several of Arabian Nights. If it's a heads, it's good. If it's tails, it's bad. They did have a couple of dexterity cards. We have to actually literally flip the card over. And a couple cards, not many, actually used dice in Magic the Gathering. And the Forgotten Realms set more recently, uses a little bit more of that. But again, Star Wars CCG wanted to introduce randomness more naturally in the game. They didn't want you to have dice or coins or flipping a card or weird stuff. They wanted you to be able to just use the cards, but still have some element of luck, and player agency. So their solution was that every card has a destiny numbers. So generally speaking, the good cards have low destinies, utility cards have medium destinies, and esoteric, harder to use cards have high destinies. So an example of this is Darth Vader. It's a very good card, but he has a destiny of 1, which is almost the worst destiny you can have. You have Imperial Bear, which is a good utility card. It can stop battles when you're not ready. Destiny 4 in the middle, and then card like Binders, which is only good if you can capture characters more esoteric, but has a destiny of 6 if you happen to track it. So for some examples here, that you may have Obi-Wan Kenobi, it's a good card, destiny 1. You may have Obi-Wan's lightsaber, plus you hit other characters, make them forfeit 0 of destiny 1, also a good card. However, in order to hit other characters, you have to have both of those drawn destiny cards greater than the defense value. So if all your deck is Obi-Wan Kenobis and Obi-Wan's lightsabers, you're never going to hit Darth Vader because he has an ability of 6. All you would draw would be a 1 and a 1 and a 2. So you have to have some deck diversity in order to have decent chances of winning. Now, Magic the Gathering, you could have 7-card maximum hands, excess cards discarded end of turn. There were some cards that increased this limit, such as Library of Lang, which is from Alpha, Reliquary Tower, Spellbook, Curiosity Crafter. There's a bunch of these. But generally speaking, you want to have as many cards as possible. There's a couple cards like Black Vise, Iron Maiden, Spiraling Embers, Gaze of Adamaro, which do punish more cards in hand. But generally speaking, you always want to have more cards in hand. There's not really a reason, other than a few rare cards, not to have more cards in hand. So if you can get past this, 7-card maximum limit, you want to, generally speaking. Now, going along kind of with this item here, they didn't originally have copulent. So the 1990 rules, you could have potentially a deck with 18 Black Lotus, 18 Time Twister, 2 Time Walks, 2 Juggernauts. I went over this in the last video, but basically you can use this combo of cards to keep on cycling, using your Black Lotus to cast Time Twisters, to cycle through till you cast Juggernauts, till you cast enough Time Walks, stack all your Time Walks, get tons of extra turn, and win. There's different variations you can play this. You can play with Fireball, you can play other things, Black Vise as well, but generally speaking, if you have a lot of Black Lotuses or a lot of these Power 9 cards, you should generally use as many as you can, as many as you're able to afford. And so, yes, the 1994 rules cut this down. So it used to be infinite cards that you could fit in a deck. Now you have maximum of 4. But even for Type 2, right? So here's the Junior Pro Tour winner of 1996. What did his deck have? Well, he had 4 Hypnotic Specters, 4 Order of the Even Hands, 4 Dark Ritual, 4 Hymn to Torok, 4 Icequakes, 4 Mishra's Factory. If a card is powerful, you want as many as you can. And so the only reason people have 4 Hypnotic Specters or 4 Dark Rituals is because the arbitrary limit says you can only have 4 of those. See a link there. They also have the restricted list, which we talked about. And so, okay, you can only have 1 of each of these cards. Well, a very famous deck, winner of DungeonCon 1995. Few permutations of this exist outside, but this changed the game. Well, what did it have? Well, all of these cards you see on your screen are the restricted type, so maximum of 1. Well, guess what? This deck had 17 of them, because all of these cards are very powerful, even if you only have 1 of them. So if it was busted at, 17, it's busted at 4, it's busted at 1 of. And so this one was very famous. You can see an example of it there. So SWCCG wanted to have a more elegant design, right? No maximum hand size, but if you have too many, you could be punished. No maximum copies of a card. You want to have, 50 million cards you can, but too many copies would be punished. So some of the cards that did for you is Monarch, which does both of those. So if you have 13 more cards in hand, you can play Monarch or Grimtosh, and they'll, go to the used pile, won't be there more. Or you can use the lost version, and any copies in their hand will go away. So having copies in your hand is actually a liability. So if you have too many copies, you could lose them. They'll be hell to pay, or what are you trying to push on us, grabbers? So if your deck uses a lot of the same interrupts, every time they use it, they'll continue to be grabbed. And so again, it's just another way of punishing copies. This is another way to do it. Voyeur, or visored vision, same idea. If you have a lot of interrupts in your used pile, if you know what they are, you can make them lose all of them, or make them lose a lot of force. And later on in sets, like Coruscant, whatever, you have drop or thrown back, which use an effect to do kind of the same thing that Monarch did or Grimtosh did, where they have to lose excess cards back to the used pile. So having too many cards is a liability potentially too. So another rule they had was the uniqueness and the cumulative rule to combat card copies. So you will notice here they have, a black dot here, they have a red dot here, they have 3 black dots here. What does that mean? Well, let's go into it. So for Luke Skywalker, that 1 black dot, what does that mean? Well, it means basically you only have 1 copy of that card table. So there's only 1 Luke Skywalker, only 1 can be deployed at a time. And if a card like Clash of Sabers or like an interrupt, if they have a 1 dot there, just means you can only use it once per turn. So even if the interrupt is super powerful, overpowered, whatever, the uniqueness is a limiting effect on that. Most interrupts are unique in this sense, or many are at the very least, that you can only use them once per turn. You can't just Clash of Saber, Clash of Saber, Clash of Saber, Clash of Saber, and make everyone there not able to move or battle. Now, some cards do have multiple dots there. So Baragwen has multiple 3 dots, means you only have 3 of them, deployed on the table at once. Cards like Rebel Artillery is a weird exception where you can use this card twice per turn, not 50 million times, but twice. Some things. We also have the cumulative rule, which basically says that multiple copies of the same exact card or card text do not add together unless their text explicitly introduces the word cumulative or cumulatively. So one example is Cytor Calfaz. So you notice it has no dot there, which means you could use this as many times as you want to. And you'll notice that there is, however, it does not use the word cumulatively there. So what does that mean? So you could have a card like Chewbacca. You could put 4 Cytor Calfaz on it because you can. There's nothing to stop you. However, because of the cumulative rule, you only get the effect of one of these, power plus 1. So Chewbacca's power would be 6 plus 1, 7. It would not be 10. And so no super easy Wookiee Strangle for you. You have to work a little harder to, get that to work a little bit easier. So Star Wars CCG has no restricted list or no ban list. So that's what the community of Magic the Gathering. It wasn't super popular with casual players. And so Star Wars CCG wanted to explicitly be different and not go down those routes. Now, however, what they would do is they would give overpowered cards or strategies silver bullets. What do we mean? What do we mean by that? Well, so one card they released was Numbers 3721 or Never Tell Me the Odds. Later on, over time, they would release cards that canceled. So Insight Serves You Well is a very classic example that counters that directly. You could have objectives that maybe were overpowered or needed some counters. And so one example is, Failure to Cave and Broken Concentration really hammer Miami He'll learn well. And so they can effectively be a counter for that, mitigate a lot. The generic sites, most of them are very powerful. By the time of Jabba's Palace sealed deck, they wanted to mitigate some of the powers of those. And so cards like Unitab or No Escape did that, and basically they nullified a lot of the benefits of those. Cards like Asteroid Sanctuary, which they felt was problematic later, so they gave cards like Come Here Big Coward, which canceled it under most circumstances as well. So to summarize, Magic the Gathering's initial design was very broken. Effective turn 1 wins with no opponent interaction was very possible, and no reason other than money or availability of printed cards not to have tons of Black Lotuses, Time Twisters, Time Walks, much of the Power 9 as you can possibly get. The 1994 revised rules weren't much better. They restricted the broken cards to a maximum of 1 and the regular cards to a maximum of 4. However, the top decks still would use as many restricted cards as they possibly could, and they often used the 4 best cards. There was no inherent mechanical reason not to use card copies other than, being told by the rules an arbitrary number is all that you can use. And furthermore, their 1995 rules literally split the community into 2, with the Type 1 to the Type 2, and players that couldn't afford the old cards liked it. However, the players that spent money in the old sets didn't like having their cards become unplayable. Furthermore, when they launched Type 2, they had some bungling of it because of the Chronicle set, where quite literally some of the legend cards, this was the original Raven Knights, print, was not legal, but it was made legal by the Chronicle set, but the symbol was used exactly the same. So you would have to consult a list to know what was legal or illegal. It was kind of confusing, and was not done well. Magic the Gathering still had many inelegant parts to it. They required pen and paper or some method to track life. They required tokens, dice, coins, etc., depending on which cards you use. And like we mentioned earlier, you generally want to have as many copies of the same card as you can possibly get. And generally speaking, you want to have as large of a hand as you can if possible. And they banned or restricted a lot of cards, which a lot of players, frankly didn't like. And they could have tried to make stronger counters. So Decipher solved many of these issues with Star Wars CCG. They made it, simplified in that all you need is your 60-card deck, nothing else outside, no pen, paper, dice, coins, etc. Randomness will be handled by the destiny draws that exist on every card in of themselves, but the players have their own agency to craft their own decks. So if you need higher destinies in your deck, you can put more high destiny cards. If you need less, you can put more powerful cards that will generally lower the average destiny of your deck as well. No arbitrary max of 4 or max of 1 restrictions. Put as many card copies as you feel necessary. Chef's kiss. It's beautiful. You naturally don't want to have 50 million copies of a card because of card uniqueness rules, low destiny numbers, cumulative rules, grabbers, cards like Monarch and Grimtash, and you naturally don't have too many cards in hand because, again, of Monarch and Grimtash or cards like Drop and Thrown Back, which can punish having too many cards in hand. Summarize, SWCCG solved a lot of the issues Magic the Gathering had while creating its own distinct, iconic, fun game. It was inspired by Magic the Gathering, chess, and role-playing games, but it still delivers a relatively simple but deep deck building and gameplay experience that makes one feel they're playing their own Star Wars episode. Star Wars CCG is a true work of art developed by artists. It's fun and engaging, even years later. It's one of my favorite games, and it's one of the greatest of all time. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please do sign up to the links below to join the 2026 Retro Game PC and the 2026 Retro Jawa Championship. Should be fun. Have some participation prizes and achievement prizes. And take care. Thanks.